Hi everyone. Can you hear me? Is there a way to confirm that? Hopefully. Okay. Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm Tim Beiko. I work with the Ethereum Foundation, and the main thing I do there is facilitate the Alcore Devs calls. And so today I want to take the time to walk through basically the entire process of how Ethereum governance works, who are the different actors in the process, and sort of where we're at in terms of the evolution of the governance processes today. So I think that the right place to start this is to just kind of define what is being governed when we talk about Ethereum governance. And I think there's effectively two things that we end up kind of discussing and doing the active governance over. The first is the set of Ethereum protocol rules. So the Ethereum protocol is like a set of instructions that are defined, and there's effectively two types of protocol rules. There's the ones which every single node on the network must agree to. So these are what we call consensus rules to define in things like the yellow paper, the beacon chain spec, the Python spec, and EIPs. And basically, if your node does not follow these rules, it's effectively separate from the rest of the Ethereum protocol. So this is kind of the most important part of protocol rules we need to agree on. We also have another set of rules that are more, you can think of them as nice to haves. So these are like all of the APIs that nodes expose to interact with infrastructure, or even that nodes use to communicate between each other. So things like networking APIs, the engine API for the consensus layer to communicate with the execution layer, and so on. So all these are also things we govern on, but they don't strictly define kind of the rules of consensus on the network. And then the other thing I think is important to caveat is that the Ethereum protocol is like the set of rules which can be instantiated in many different contexts. And so when we talk about Ethereum governance, we usually discuss like the governance of the Ethereum mainnet, or what's like the network with chain ID 1, where there's all of the accounts and balances and contracts that we care about, and obviously all of the applications that people use. So this is effectively what gets governed through Ethereum's governance process. And so most of this talk will cover who governs Ethereum, and this is my sort of outline, and we'll start from the core and make our way out. So if we just define like the Ethereum protocol, what's being governed, then I'll walk through every one of these stakeholders and kind of explain their role in the process to hopefully give you a better understanding of the whole thing. So first, if you think of core devs, so there's not a hard and fast definition here, but it's effectively, a mix of all of the people, like the client developer, researchers, and others who spend all of their time contributing to the Ethereum protocol. Most of the actual client developers are spread out across 10 different teams, which are nested in different types of organizations and spread out around large parts of the world. And similarly, on the research side, we have people who are from academia, from VC funds, anons, people working at companies, people at the EF, and so on. And the entire kind of process around governing Ethereum and core dev discussion is mostly open. So we tend to get a lot of people who just show up in the Discord. And I've posted 4 examples here on the slide of folks who over the years have showed up and made really good contributions. So, first little bubble here is Danny Ryan, who came with no sort of context of Ethereum, and over the years helped ship the beacon chain, the merge, and now coordinates a lot of the work on the proof of stake and research side. There's also POTUS, who is just a random person who showed up in the Discord to discuss Ethereum, and then now works with the Prismatic team. Proto Lambda, similarly, was someone who just showed up even before we had a Discord, helped set it up, and worked on some of our research problems, and eventually ended up doing a lot of really valuable work on the beacon chain, on obviously proto-dank sharding, and now on L2s. And this last example I really like, so we had this person called C-Monkey who showed up during the merge, who literally ran every possible client combination on their home computer to see if there were any issues or bugs and kind of report those. And no one had ever met them before. So it's really kind of this ecosystem of people who come together and just end up solving protocol problems, but there's not a ton of barriers to get people in. And I'll give a quick shout now, if this is something you'd be interested in doing, we've started a fellowship program, which is basically a 4-month, you can think of it as an internship or grant for people to come in and work on open protocol problems. We have an application open right now, so if you scan this QR code, or you just go to blog.ethereum.org, you can see the application. You can apply and get paid to do this stuff for the next 4 months. But yeah, So high level, core dev is this very rough group. There's not a clear definition. The way I think about it is, people who are focused on the Ethereum protocol beyond just a single EIP. So they're not coming here just to push a single change, but they really care about it over like a long period of time. And this generally means they take responsibility for like the security of the system as a whole. And those are the people who, come to consensus on like what changes should we make to specs, the implementations, and, should we propose these in the network upgrade to Ethereum? And I think, this is a very loose definition, but like there's a ton of value in actually keeping this like loosely defined. Afri said it better than I ever could in a GitHub comment on another project who wanted to like have a more closed and formal definition of core devs. But I think he hits on like all the points why this is actually quite valuable to have it be a vague group, even though it's like harder to paint a picture of exactly who is a core dev. And some things we do to keep it open. So one, all of the calls end up recorded or live streamed so people can follow them, even though, they're not necessarily like in touch with everyone on the calls. And we also have like these forums like ETH Research and ETH Magicians where a lot of the ideas and proposals get discussed in public and anyone can come in and opine on them. So the next kind of stakeholder set in the governance process is EIP champion. So similarly to core development, anyone can sort of write an EIP. There's a template at eeps.ethereum.org. If you don't know, EIP stands for Ethereum Improvement Proposal. And the idea there is like, this is the formal process to make a specification for a change you'd like to do. In practice, the larger the change you want to propose, the more you're going to have to work closely with like the different client and research teams to understand, the full impact that it has on Ethereum. And if you do like take this on, I think, the role as like an EIP champion is like, can you demonstrate that this is a valuable change and that it's not going to break Ethereum, and then show that there's like momentum and there's a desire in the community to see this change. And the way this usually goes is people come up with a new idea for Ethereum, and then this would be super valuable, but it has a security risk, often a DOS risk. I just did a quick search on ETH Magicians, and you can see if I search for DOS, pretty much every major EIP that like we've been talking about recently has a forum thread about DOS. So you have the account abstraction one, 4844. You have the withdrawal EIP. So this is where a lot of the actual work ends up happening, figuring out a design for your EIP that's actually safe for mainnet. And then if you do everything right, then your EIP would, might be included in an upgrade eventually. And here's an example that, I think recaps like the whole process quite well from EIP 1153, which folks from the Uniswap team championed. They did all the implementations. They added a bunch of tests. They kind of gathered support by different projects that this was valuable. And then they spent, a ton of time just going back and forth with the different client teams and trying to see, are there any objections here? Does this make sense to prioritize? Are there anything they can do? Is there anything they can do to like help with the process? So one question that usually comes up, at this point is like, so if, the core devs and EIP champions write all the specs, write all the code, doesn't this mean they effectively control Ethereum's governance? And my answer is no. So rest of the talk will focus on everyone else beyond those two groups and the impact that they can have on the Ethereum governance process. So first, if you start expanding outward, the next logical step is consensus participants. So these are either miners on a proof of work network or validators on Ethereum proof of stake today. And so if you have a set of change that core devs and EIP champions agree, we're going to propose this network upgrade, you need at least one of the consensus participants to agree to run this software for the network to upgrade, right? Otherwise, the upgrade just never happens on chain. So this is really like the bare minimum requirement where consensus participants are required to at least buy into the upgrade. Otherwise, you can't have this new feature happen. And obviously, if only part of the consensus participants upgrade and not all of them, then we effectively get a chain split on mainnet. And the way this would work on Ethereum, so under the proof of stake algorithm, is if the consensus participants on both sides of the fork disagree with each other, and they'll simply start leaking or burning the ETH of the validators on the other side until they represent less than a third of the stake, so that each chain can like respectively finalize on their own end. And one thing that's worth kind of highlighting in Ethereum is that, core devs as like a whole just don't run a significant percentage of consensus nodes. So here are like just like some quick back of the envelope numbers. about a year or so ago, 2 years now ago, we announced this client incentive program, which the EF basically granted a bunch of validators to all of the client teams. So this was about a total of like 1,400 validators. But imagine, client teams are secretly colluding and they have like 10x more validators than this hidden somewhere that no one knows about. So this would put them at about 14,000 validators. Today, there's about 600,000 validators on the network. So, anywhere within this 1,400 to 40,000 bound gives you like about 0.2 to 2.5% of the network that like core devs could effectively upgrade to if they wanted. So this still means like the vast majority of the Ethereum network just wouldn't follow their upgrade, and there'd be a small minority of the consensus share. And then imagine, a world where even the EF decides to join forces with them. The EF's ETH balance is public. It's about 320,000 ETH. First of all, this balance is not staked, so the EF would have to deposit all of this, activate all those validators, which would delay things. But even if you went through this entire process and had this like worst case secret Shadowy scenario for core devs, you'd have about 4% of the network with like the EF and core devs. So this shows you that like the overwhelming majority of the consensus participants are folks external to this. And so this acts as a sort of check where, these are the people that need to be convinced that this upgrade is worthwhile to run. But even if this happens, consensus participants don't necessarily get a final say on the state of the network. So the other thing that's really important on Ethereum is node operators. And this is why we spend so much time talking about decentralization and like the gas limit and stuff like that. And the reason is that on Ethereum, every single node on the network validates every single transaction. And a little sidebar here is that validator is therefore a terrible term because it sort of implies they're the only ones who make sure the chain is valid. And this is not true. Like every single node, that you can run, you don't need 32 ETH for this, you just need to run the software, will run through every transaction it receives and make sure it's valid. So if you have a blockchain network where only the validators are the one running nodes, they can collude and change the protocol rules without anyone noticing, because nobody's like sanity checking that those things are actually, that those transactions and those blocks are actually valid. And the smaller your validator set is, then the easier it is for them to collude, obviously. And collusion is kind of the negative version of this, but you could imagine like a less malicious version, which is just having a coordinated bug, right? They all run the same software in the same environment or whatever, and then there's this issue, and that affects the stability of the whole network or kind of creates a bug in the entire network. So if we have a blockchain network where instead the non-staking nodes are abundant, when you propose a block as a validator, you know that if it's invalid, say you mint yourself like 1,000 ETH, it'll be rejected by both the other staking nodes who are like different to you and the non-staking nodes, which validates the network or validate the blocks every time they see it. And again, sorry for the terrible terminology here. So sort of you can think of like the benefit you provide when you run a node is you're sharing your view of what the correct chain and correct protocol rules should be to all your peers on the network and helping like counter any malicious block that would pass in, and having enough of these acts as like a deterrent to any validator to propose an invalid block because they know that they'll just get rejected from the chain and they'll forego the rewards they could have had if they would have proposed a valid block. And again here, I'll show a quick grants notes that the EF announced yesterday, where they want to try and get folks who historically haven't run nodes or in different contexts want to set up nodes to do so. So if you haven't run a node or you have a community somewhere that like would like to get into this, again, scan this QR code or go to esp.ethereum.org and yeah, you can apply for a grant to run a node. So if we have, so we have the, core devs, EIP champions, consensus participants, node operators. What's like the next step in governance? Then that would be the users of Ethereum. And the way this question often comes up is, can a single project decide which Ethereum fork wins if there is like a contentious fork? And here, it's just worth explaining real quick what happens if there is a fork on the network for all of the smart contracts and users on the network. So at a high level, at the point of the fork, so when there's like a disagreement about the state of the chain, the entire network state would be duplicated. So every balance, every contract, every token, every NFT would end up on both sides of the chain. And there's things for which this is like mostly fine. So for example, like the ETH asset itself can be on different chains and have, a different price. So this is what you see with ETH versus Ethereum Classic. When the fork happened, both assets sort of went on their own way and, they just trade differently. You can imagine some on-chain NFTs being the same, where like they don't have a dependency on anything else. So the community can choose which one is right or wrong, or maybe there's like a market between the two where one is just more valuable than the other. But there's some projects which like really have to make a decision because they sort of depend on something outside the chain that can't be duplicated. So any sort of real world asset, including stable coins, if there's just $1 in a bank account, it obviously can't map to like $2 redemption tokens on chain. If you have an oracle, similarly, if it's reporting like the value of ETH on a centralized exchange, it needs to decide which ticker from which centralized exchange maps to which chain. And similarly, things like bridges, obviously, if you're depositing funds from chain A to chain B, you want to make sure that like there's only one place the funds can be coming to and being sent back to. So this means that if there is a fork like this, obviously, as a whole, all of the users of Ethereum and projects built on it have a huge say in governance because they can coordinate on which fork they should use. And the better their coordination is, the less issues there'll be with the actual transition. But this also implies that like it's extremely hard for a single project to do this. So if you have 99% of the projects going on fork A, even if like a major project decides to go on fork B, it doesn't guarantee that like all these other projects have to follow it. It just means that it'll create some friction during this transition. But yeah, there's really like an element here of like this loose coordination within the ecosystem is extremely powerful, but also very hard to like align on because there's not a single formal process to do so. And I think if you go even a step beyond this, to what we often call the community, or bankless people will call layer 0, you have an even more like, high-level version of this idea, which is that like at the end of the day, Ethereum and a bunch of other systems are just like this shared concept we agree to, and like that we sort of come to consensus on as humans as having a different set of properties. And when we have changes we want to do in like a happy case, we can easily define processes for this. So we have the EIP process to like specify things, the network upgrade process to actually activate changes, and so on. But if there are extreme cases, things like contentious forks or social slashings or whatnot, then it becomes much more of a social question of like, what does the community want and what second order impacts are they willing to tolerate around this? So obviously, anytime there's like a fork, and the DAO on Ethereum is probably the best example, if it affects like the credible neutrality of the platform. Like, can you actually build something on this and have it not change? If there's forks all the time, or if people can't have like good guarantees about the stuff that they've deployed on chain sort of remaining there, then it sort of hurts away at the platform stability of Ethereum. And there's no like official constitution or like written social contract on this, but this is effectively like what the community ends up agreeing to, and it can massively move like what Ethereum is if there's enough like of a desire to change what we coordinate on. And the reason why this is possible is like these systems are permissionless and open, right? If the Ethereum Foundation or any client team owned everything and like no one could sort of take it and run with it, then it would be much harder for a community to do this. And one example that I kind of like outside of Ethereum about this is like Bitcoin as like official website. So Bitcoin had like this Bitcoin Cash fork, many years ago, and today there's two sort of, I would call like first tier 1 domains, bitcoin.com and bitcoin.org, and they point to completely different projects. And regardless of what you think about, Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin, the fact that like this is even possible shows you like the sort of power of these permissionless systems, where like a fraction of the community is able to come and like sort of disagree with the rest and set up their own kind of alternative fork, and come to consensus that this is what they want to call Bitcoin, or this is what they don't want to call Bitcoin. So hopefully this gives like a good overview of the different like stakeholders in the system. And I think that maybe the takeaway here is that like we have these groups that are like closer to the protocol, that have more formalized processes, and oftentimes these appear to like have a greater influence on the network just because we're able to like formalize their actions a bit more. But I would argue that like the more you grow out of the outside of this like circle, the more power there actually is within these groups, but the coordination costs just grow more and more. So it's like a harder power to wield in a way. But there's a ton of value in having this. And the rest of the talk will sort of walk through, what would happen if we didn't, or how in practice it has been used on Ethereum. And yeah, I guess I front ran my slides there. But so why don't we actually feel these stakeholders more? And I think part of the reason is like core devs try to listen to other parts of the community and have like a strong incentive to not push an upgrade that's contentious or could break the network, because if they do so and like the network splits and things are chaos for like the next 6 months, they're the one who actually have to like fix this and deal with it over by writing the actual software. And I think it's sort of going over a couple examples of like contentious EIPs that's been proposed and how they've like ended or not ended up in upgrades. So I mentioned this earlier. The DAO is probably the first big contentious thing in Ethereum's history, definitely the most contentious. So there was this huge hack, about 15% of the ETH supply was affected. And there what was interesting is like core devs actually took a pretty neutral stance where they put out software that let users flag whether or not they wanted to like run a network upgrade that would help repair the damages caused by the hack. And they let users sort of decide whether or not they wanted to activate the software. The vast majority of users decided that they wanted to, and this is what we still call Ethereum today. But a subset of the community did not want, and this is where Ethereum Classic comes from. Then after that, there was this large hack or bug, I guess, in a multi-sig wallet that was developed by Parity, which effectively bricked all of the funds that were held in any Parity multi-sig wallet deployed at that time. And there was an EIP proposed to address this, EIP 999. And one thing that's interesting here is like this was a pretty huge hack. It affected the second most used client team, so Parity, and the leader of the Parity team, Gavin, was one of Ethereum's co-founders. So it's hard to think of like a bug that would affect a party that's like more central to Ethereum's development or like history in a way. And despite all of this, the client teams never proposed EIP 999 in an upgrade because of the strong community pushback. So this is an example where like obviously the interests of some of the core team were like strongly aligned with having this change through, but like the community pushing back meant that core devs didn't even try to like run it through the upgrade process and potentially get a fork because it felt like the odds of the fork actually working and people coalescing around this being Ethereum were quite low. And one, I'd say, less extreme example a bit after that was ProgPal, so EIP 10.15.7. The idea here was to change how proof of work worked on Ethereum to keep it more ASIC resistant, which was stated as a goal in Ethereum's yellow paper. I'd say there was like some mild to like moderately high support within the core dev community for this, but it never got proposed in the network upgrade, again, due to community pushback around not wanting to like change the way the market structure was developing on proof of work. And then lastly, I'd say, the merge was this huge transition to the network. So we moved from proof of work to proof of stake. And this is something that had been, part of Ethereum, like quote unquote roadmap since day one, where, it was always sort of a goal of trying to get Ethereum off proof of work. And I think because of this, there was tons of community support. Obviously, miners were the only ones who were opposed to this because it ended their proof of work business. But I think this was a case where core devs felt strongly enough to propose this upgrade, thinking that you'd have the vast majority of the community adopt it. And this is effectively what happened. There was still like a tiny minority that decided not to upgrade, called Ethereum W, I think it's Ethereum Works. It still exists, it's like chugging along, but I think today, the over 99% of like value and whatnot is all on Ethereum, which is transitioned to proof of stake. So I think it's worth like just pausing and highlighting like what are the pros and cons of like the system of governance that we have. One pro, and I've tried to emphasize this a couple of times, just like because it's permissionless, anyone can show up and participate. So there's no sort of formal gate you have to cross or like checkbox you have to fill to participate in Ethereum governance. And I'd say, the failure mode of something like this is like best encapsulated in this essay, Tyranny of the Structurelessness. If you've never read it, I strongly recommend it, which talks about all the ways structures like this can go wrong. And then one thing that's also very good about this process is I would consider it quite capture resistant, where if there is an attack on the governance process, because it's not extremely formalized, like, oh, you have to do thing A, thing B, thing C, and then your change can happen, then we can change the process in response to attacks. And this means, though, that if you come in as an outsider and you don't have a ton of context, it's really hard to like understand the governance process really well, because again, there's not like this checklist that tells you exactly the things you need to do. And then the last pro I'll say is this process where we have all these different stakeholders, which each can, affect the outcome of governance, gives us a lot of checks and balances by different parts of the community, which helps, changes when they are adopted, be adopted by like all of Ethereum, and make sure that, everyone sort of has buy-in into this. And then obviously the flip side of this is because we have this like huge diverse group of like different actors with different incentives, it's really hard to gauge what the community consensus is when there is like a more contentious change. And I'll end with just some thoughts on like sort of where we're at in terms of Ethereum governance and what the potential like future looks like. So one thing I've noticed in the past like couple of years is there's more and more stakeholders who are involved in this. So we've gone from a world where like, no one builds on Ethereum to like, we have a lot of apps on Ethereum. And I think today we're like in this third phase where we have a lot of applications and infrastructure built around Ethereum who are wanting to start to contribute back to help build this infrastructure. So we have, L2s, infrastructure teams, major applications that each want to like contribute back to the protocol and help, improve things. In parallel to that, though, a lot of like the easy low-hanging fruits that we could do to make Ethereum better have basically been done. So we have what are left, I call this like high-hanging fruits, where all these new proposals and like larger changes we want to do, they do involve complex trade-offs, which like have reasonable arguments on both sides of it. And there's not as many just like net wins without any potential downsides. So if you combine those two things together, you have more people that need to agree on stuff, and the things they need to agree on have like more trade-offs. It does make it harder to move things forward. There's like more friction in like changing Ethereum. And in addition to this, there's more value built on Ethereum. There's more users and whatnot. So it means that like by default, things sort of slow down. And one open question here is like, is the end game or like natural path to ossify by default? Is there like another alternative here? Is this sort of doomed to ossifying? And I think, while we're like thinking about the big question, there's a few tiny things that myself and my team and others have been trying to like do at the margin to help make governance a little bit better and a little bit cleaner. So first is just trying to get an aligned specification format on the consensus and execution layer. So both these like parts of the networks started in very different circumstances, which led them to use like different tools. And hopefully we can like align all of that together so that if someone wants to make a change to Ethereum or reason about the changes proposed to Ethereum, there's like a single coherent place they can look at rather than like 4 different things that may or may not look like each other. I think another thing that's really important is trying to be a bit more async in our process and like a bit more long-lived. So I mentioned ETH magicians before. So trying to like use this as a way to like gather feedback, signal changes, and collect opinions rather than things like calls or even worse, like comments on call agendas, because hopefully it's like a bit more lasting and it lets people kind of get a record of what happened and understand the context a bit more. And then one kind of larger moonshots that we're trying is this Summer of Protocols initiatives, where the EF is funding about 30-ish people to spend the entire summer thinking about hard problems and protocols, not even just in blockchain, but across any domain, with the hope that some of those insights are useful to like figuring out what we do to Ethereum. And I guess, some of the open questions or just things I've been thinking a lot on is, how do we trade off this like speed versus stability? So if we are going to a world where like it's going to get harder and harder to make changes in the future, this sort of implies we should do a lot of the changes we want to do now, so that we can. But this kind of comes at the cost of stability, where there's more stuff built on the network, and we want to make sure that like we're not breaking everything. You're requiring people to upgrade like way too often. I think the other big question is like, should we think about L1 and L2 standardization, if at all? Like, is there something there that, if Ethereum L1 stops changing or becomes much slower, are there parts of the Ethereum governance that should extend to L2, while at the same time leaving like the room for L2s to create like way more diverse ecosystems where they're not all constrained by the same processes? And then lastly, I sort of touched on this already, but like, is there a way that we can make this entire process less focused on like live calls? I think the calls are great because they give us momentum and they sort of are a forcing function for people to show up every week or two and like, make progress. But they're obviously kind of a bit restrictive in that you have to like be awake when they happen. You have to like speak English, and be like comfortable speaking on the spot and like debating things on the fly. So like, is there a way we can slowly move things to be a bit more async, without hopefully losing too much momentum? And that's all I had. Thank you so much for listening. I don't know if there's time or a way to do questions. Happy to do so if we can. Otherwise, I'm Tim Beiko on Twitter, or you can write to me, tim@ethereum.org. I'm happy to chat about governance in either of those spaces. Yeah, thank you very much.